Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Podcasting is War with Critical and F. Still don't have a proper intro this time, but I'm the one doing it. We have a guest this time for our third episode, bentosekai from Twitter. Now, who are you and why are you here, Ben?
All right. So seeing as I'm the only reasonable KyoAni stan on all of AniTwit, I thought I would come on here to address this one question that I got on my Curious Cat that you guys also found pretty poignant. I guess I'll read it out now. The question is, what is good writing? If you believe in subjectivity, then what is good writing for you? And my answer was, for me, it basically comes down to whether a story can effectively communicate whatever themes it aims to get across to its audience, regardless of its form. Good writing is a bit of an ambiguous label, considering that you can tell a story well in many different ways. There are so many factors to consider here. But for example, a cute girls doing cute things anime that succeeds in being cute, develops an endearing cast, and has some kind of emotional payoff along the way is something that might merit being called well written. The same goes for a mystery that builds intrigue, makes use of foreshadowing in a subtle and clever way, and immerses the reader or viewer in the setting. I refuse to go down this rabbit hole again, but it's worth pointing out that objectively good is a phrase that makes no literal sense, considering the definitions of each word. And that's it.
Crit, will you continue from this point?
It always goes to me, huh? Well, I think that is a fairly solid foundation, though we're still kinda all clueless as to what actually is the good writing.
Yeah, it's pretty elusive as a concept.
I mean, I have my own examples of things that I believe have good writing for various different reasons. Like, for example, the only book I know that exists is the A Song of Ice and Fire series. And George R. R. Martin, luckily, is one of the most vocal and, famous authors living today. He speaks in a lot of interviews and a lot of conventions and, hours of content of him just discussing his work. And one of the things that he often talks about is the rationalism behind his writing. He tries to make things make a lot of sense, to be very logical and as well as realistic, which, distinguished him for a fantasy work of writing.
Yeah, and I think if you have an author that has a real intent from the get-go, they can come up with stories that a lot more people would consider, good writing. I think of Attack on Titan when I think of something like that, where you can clearly tell that there's an intent in the way the story is being told, and there's a hell of a lot of foreshadowing involved. And I know people use foreshadowing as this kind of be-all, end-all, but I don't know. I think that it's really important to have an idea of what you're trying to tell before you tell a story. And so those kinds of authors can really set themselves apart by laying out reasonably intricate plots that also make sense.
I know this isn't the most common opinion on Attack on Titan, but I watched it. It was my first anime that I watched being conscious of the concept. And I think very much immediately from the first episode or the first couple episodes, when you see the world and how it's set up with the the three walls and the Titans outside, and the use of technology and the setting and the motivation of the main character, you can tell that it's a story that's going to expand greatly and really build on these foundations, because it's already so complex just from the concept.
Yeah, exactly. And you see that too with the character's ambitions, and it's very clearly laid out how the main trio kind of interact with more and more people, and the network of characters builds and builds, just like their understanding of the world around them. It's very well laid out in a way that you kind of know that there's more out there. They always talk about how there's more out there, and spoiler alert, there is more out there.
It's like a tree growing, only except instead of a seed being planted, it's it's already a little sapling,
a little sapling.
As soon as you open the book, then there is information and ideas to be processed, and you're even though the art in the manga isn't great in the beginning, you can go whoa, that's a concept. Okay. And,
they're clearly
it does
the roots.
Good job at grabbing your attention.
They're clearly the roots of a good story. And you could say the same of a story like Monster, where right from the get-go, there's just so much intrigue dropped on you, and even the world itself feels very fleshed out. I know because it's a realistic setting, that makes sense, of course, but Monster does a really, really good job of building that exposition. And the exposition, a solid exposition, could be said to be a characteristic of good writing.
Yeah, and I guess you could say a good hook in the beginning as well is something that, not necessarily, but often is a benefit to a story, something important to consider when making one.
Yeah, and this definitely comes up with anime because first episodes are very important. I know people talk about the three-episode rule and stuff like that, but yeah, really from the first episode, you can usually tell whether or not a story has had significant effort put into it to be kind of more grounded or more fantastical or more,
Yeah. Tone
in its
and
delivery.
Ideas, premise and setting.
I think something people generally underappreciate or do not realize is tone, which can also be in text, really, like normal book writing. Like the prose does a lot of toning too.
Right.
So setting a solid tone right from the get-go can intrigue you to a story very easily. That's how I, as example, got really into Dora from the very first 10 minutes I watched back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Like, if Dora didn't have so much tonal flair, I don't know if I would have stuck to it.
And there's also no shortage of anime as well as other things that I've seen that I just, I'm not sure, what this is trying to do or what I'm supposed to, be seeking from it.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of stories, they rely on kind of immediate appeal, and visual appeal is definitely a part of it for anime. But if you really want to pull someone in, you need a good hook, like you said, with the story. Otherwise, it just ends up falling flat.
This is probably why the most acclaimed works in general always have some mystery aspect to it. Like, of course, Monsters, a thriller, Attack on Titan has a huge mystery aspect to it. FMA even has a few mysteries, so every story that's really acclaimed has a lot of mysteries in the world.
Evangelion, Berserk, they all have overarching mystery.
Yeah.
Because you need some bits and pieces to figure out along the ride to keep you invested and figure out the world too.
And that's what Brandon Sanderson, the author of the Stormfront Archives, is that what it's called?
Stormlight, I think. Stormlight,
yeah.
I think you made the title cooler.
I'm mostly familiar with him as a YouTuber because, as I said, I know of no books that exist.
I know a book, it's called The Bible.
Whoa.
It's not much of a story.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist to me.
And Brandon Sanderson had this lecture that was about questions and answers, basically. Each time you present a new piece of information or a mystery that could lead to somewhere, that's a question that you then keep reading in order to have it answered. And J.J. Abrams, the very acclaimed director and creator of such things as Lost and the Disney Star Wars trilogy, also had a TED Talk where he has the very memeable idea of a mystery box, though in his case, it's more that he sets up mysteries and then figures out the answer at a later time. So contrasting those two examples, I think readers of Brandon Sanderson's books can probably attest to them being very well planned out and logical in terms of the answers that are given, while something like Lost is famously in the mud because no one liked the ending or the answer that was given.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier understanding the nature of the world and kind of building the world, and I think a lot of that is about just the human condition. And so usually what we would call good writing ends up having some kind of thematic aspect that relates to not just the characters' understanding of the world, but also their place in it. If you have something like Ava, you see the characters being significantly shaped by their environment, and that can definitely build a compelling narrative as long as the tone, like F said, is consistent.
whether it's a fantastical or a realistic setting, in the most acclaimed stories, usually the common element is always that it has more realistic and emotionally rounded three-dimensional characters.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones is a good example, this fictitious fantasy setting, but all the people that are in it, express very many forms of living and experiences that people can have.
Generally, what people would consider good is when it's close to reality. Like, people want the works to be fleshed out with humane characters with humane motivations, and
something you can identify with.
It has to be like that's why themes like existentialism and stuff is so popular, to the point where I'm getting sick of seeing it. Like, I don't think there's any really good work that doesn't have it.
I think it's worth asking the question of what is bad writing in terms of trying to understand what good writing is, because you need some kind of contrast, right?
Yeah, I didn't want to be too negative. I have tried to avoid this.
Maybe in the sense that, like, in order to know happiness, you need to know pain.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to know bad writing to know good writing.
It's something I was just thinking of since we were already on tone. Even good works have often tonal whiplash because they cannot take themselves too seriously for a period of time, so they ruin the mood for some reason, and that's often something that makes people complain about it. Even though it's like a minor issue, when it happens consistently, it gets really painful. So even if the work is great, it can only become good.
You're going back to tone with that one.
I really like tone, yeah.
In regards to what Ben said, though, like the curve, or I guess the scale of what is good to bad also, changes as the landscape of art itself changes. Usually that means, time. If you go back 100 years from now, the movies that came out then are not great by, our standards, technologically, maybe idea-wise, perhaps, though there isn't, there were things that weren't known then. There was also, a smaller amount of people actually making these works. And so, there's less of a statistical probability that one of them will have, like, some masterpiece of an idea,
Mm-hmm.
But, like, when movies didn't exist at all, and then the first movies came, it didn't matter whether they were good by our current standards, because they were good to the people then, because they didn't know any better. And the same 10 years after that, as some advances were made, it's better than what was before, therefore it's good. And it goes like that all the way up to where we are now, where I think we've reached, like, a level of overall base understanding for, like, how humans respond to images and to text, to stories, that it can be, reasonably consistent and judged equally.
Going back to ambiguity, what makes generally good works is great ambiguity with great execution, and if you do anything lesser, it generally is less than good or great. So and since most entertainment is just there to entertain, it's kind of just simple and straightforward.
What do you mean by ambiguity?
Like an ambiguous story, like scale, themes. Like, I think Attack on Titan is an ambiguous story.
You mean open to interpretation?
Do I mean ambiguity or ambitiousness? I mean ambitious.
Ambitious, yeah.
Yeah, I always mistake him, I'm sorry. They sound very similar. Ambitious, that's what I mean.
Right, because I was about to go on a whole different trace.
Well, then you go there.
Well, I was confused by your use of
Oh,
the
you
word
mean,
ambiguity.
okay. I get it. It's okay.
If you had something you wanted to say, then you can continue.
Well, a story that's ambitious with ambitious themes generally tends to be well executed, I guess. There are not that many series, I think, that have grand themes and just shit the bed.
Well, yeah, I definitely think that the power of your work is somewhat determined by, like, what you try to do. Like, let's say there is a scale of what's a 10 out of 10 idea and what's a 1 out of 10 idea, If you are like, I want to do this 8 out of 10 idea, then, you may only get that far. Or you may get slightly higher or slightly lower, depending on your values and how well it is done.
So do you think the potential of the story lies in its premise and its ideas?
I definitely think high concept things like fantasy or sci-fi are inherently more interesting than like something that has a realistic setting, could have a very interesting concept, but the interesting part of it won't be related to the setting.
Mhm.
While like something that's a fantasy can have an interesting concept and an interesting setting. And so, that can make the smallest of differences, especially when you're like discussing the very top of fiction.
This will sound probably a little weird, but when we take the topic of like family, which can have many angles to it, I like Dragon Maid because it's not just about the family aspect, but also about immortality, has otakuism, and other relating themes to like the fantasy type setting it is, even though it's set in reality. So that's like more interesting than just a show where it's about a family to me.
Yeah. There is a word for that, I think, when there's like fantasy elements hidden in plain sight,
I wish we would know that, Brian.
Walking thesaurus.
Well, there are many different words for or types of fantasy, subgenres.
Yeah.
Urban to epic, low fantasy, dark fantasy.
Like if we go by levels, like level 1 fantasy.
Level 1 fantasy, and then level 100 is the max.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you brought up an interesting point about the fantasy setting appealing more to you at the high level. And that's kind of interesting to me because both of my favorite anime are set in a realistic setting. A Silent Voice and March Comes In Like a Lion.
Yes.
And so I kind of think that since we're talking about the good old subjective.
But they're not your favorites because of their setting, I assume.
No. You could say that they're not my favorites because of their setting, but they're my favorites on a kind of comprehensive level, and the setting is definitely part of that because they can tell really, really grounded stories, and they can build characters that seem or to feel real. And I think that's kind of an important aspect of a realistic setting, where in fantastical stories you can often see characters that you don't necessarily think could ever exist in real life, and that might take away from your kind of emotional attachment to the world. So I definitely have an appreciation for a story that can do a lot within the boundaries of reality.
Right, because a setting shapes a character as much as the characters shape the setting.
Yeah, exactly.
So in order to have realistic and compelling characters, there needs to be a certain realism imbued in the setting as well. Like if you compare Evangelion to Gurren Lagann, for example, not that Gurren Lagann doesn't have complex or interesting characters, but they're not necessarily very realistic.
Yeah, they're all very, very exaggerated.
Very anime.
Yeah, very archetypal
anime.
in some ways.
Crit, can you finish your sentence? What did you already?
I think I finished it.
Yeah.
Because the topic of anime made me realize a lot of people don't like when the anime act very anime. Why is that?
Like you. And
No!
like me.
No, not me. I love anime.
Like when it gets too tropey, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Definitely that.
I mean, he mentioned Gurren Lagann, and both Gurren Lagann and Code Geass have often the label of being dumb or being train wrecks because they're very anime. Kind of goofy, carefree, I guess. And that makes aspects of it bad. And I'm like, that's just anime.
That's part of the appeal too, though.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the problem with
also
subjective interpretations. Crit, go ahead.
I definitely think in order to be emotionally invested in something, you do need to identify the emotion and identify with the characters that have it, and therefore usually things that lean more towards complexity and realism are have more emotional depth, gives you a deeper experience. But there is also an appeal in surreality and exaggerated. Like even if you recognize an emotion, but the emotion is very exaggerated, then that could give it like an extra force. And that applies to even something that does have realistic elements in a fantastic setting. Like Attack on Titan is a very high concept fantasy, but it is played mostly realistically. And because the characters are also real and experience emotions in this exaggerated setting, then like those emotions are simultaneously real and heightened.
I guess that's the keyword, feeling emotions in an exaggerated setting, because that's essentially why we consume fiction.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why I do, at least.
Like, you were really into the whole emotion thing.
Well, it relates to what I was saying about, like,
That sounded awkward.
if you want to get high, you gotta aim high.
Yeah, like...
I mean, if you want to get high, that wasn't the right wording.
If you want... Yeah.
But, oh god, I completely lost it.
You were too high.
What did you say before?
What I just said? Fuck. Which part? I said, you...
Yeah, that's why we consume fiction. Yeah.
Ah, okay. That got me so off guard.
Because yeah, I do think that fiction is, in a way, like a kind of proxy or replacement for experience. Like you read something, identify with the characters, and like you get an experience out of it. And usually that's an experience you haven't had before. You want something new. And that's also why, like, when you've seen the same cliches and tropes executed a million times, you're like, I don't like this anymore, because it's no longer a new experience. And that's what I think, like, because like a realistic setting could give you an experience you haven't had, like whether it's one you haven't had in media or one you haven't had in real life, but it's something that still could theoretically be done in real life. Like if you take Sangatsu no Lion, for example, not that you'd want to experience many of the things that the characters do. In that case, it's probably more that solidarity, or like, empathy with that experience. But then you have like a fantastical high concept setting, which either a fantasy or a sci-fi, and it's like you're getting an experience, but one that you could not get anywhere else.
Like Eva.
Like Evangelion.
This is just an excuse to shill Evangelion at him.
No, but if you look at the world, sorry,
every point I make in this conversation could be used to argue why Evangelion is the greatest work.
And it is, but what I was gonna talk about with the emotion part is that Krant is a very emotional person, so he gets a lot out of fiction that is like stimulating his emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
Or like when the characters seem to experience really real emotions. That's why we are so fixated on voice acting too. Him especially.
Yeah, voice acting and facial expressions in the case of like manga and anime. Like you watch Attack on Titan Season 1, characters are very expressive. You watch The Lion King, characters are very expressive. Hunter x Hunter, characters are very expressive. And then some things aren't, but they shall not be named.
So like, no matter if it's like voice acting or artwork or like how you describe your text in your book, it's all about expression too. If you're just simple, if you're simpleton that describes your emotions simply, then it's plain and boring.
Like any expression that is, or like not facial expression, like expression of emotion, whether it's narration or dialogue or performance, any expression that is inorganic or awkward or feels insincere could, like, even if 20% of it, like 1 out of 5 elements feels awkward, feels off, that can like totally throw off the entire vibe of the scene. And this is something I'm very sensitive to, these nuances. So like things where like everything comes together in order to like portray a feeling, that's what usually strikes me. While like something can have stilted voice acting or stilted camera work, weird pauses, sound design, and it'll just completely take me out of it and actually piss me off.
And that's tonal whiplash.
Yeah.
That's what F is talking about.
Yep. It all comes together.
But it's not tonal whiplash, but it is
A part of it.
like feeling that something is not like a natural experience. The experience that you're seeking to get, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel convincing.
So the crit is the emotional guy, and since I'm the logical guy, I'm very thrown off by unfamiliar or like inconsistent structures or pacing, editing, story structures in general. That's why when I watched Attack on Titan initially, I didn't really recognize the story structures it was attempting because I was completely unfamiliar with it. I did like Attack on Titan, just to clarify, but I didn't love it. But when I got more familiar with stories and recognized its story structure as rather unique and interesting, I tended to like it more, especially when I read later.
Because when I watched it, that didn't even come as a single thought to me, because like not only was I ignorant of anime and its tropes, I was just like drowning in emotion. Like I was tearing up and getting goosebumps every episode I watched of season 1.
Yeah, I've been not very emotionally responsive to most things the past 10 years, but I've been better the past 3 years about it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of
But
people...
I've always been thrown off by structures, sorry. You speak.
Sorry. A lot of people, their main, like you said, their main reason for consuming fiction is to have those exaggerated emotional responses. And I kind of agree, or lean more towards the crit side, where I'm very emotional in my response as opposed to analytical, just in the moment to moment. And so I even I carved up half of my entire rating system for fiction to include the experience, specifically because I think it's so important in terms of what you take away from a story. I mean, if it's not making you feel anything, then what are you getting out of it?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I agree with that.
If it's not making you feel or making you think.
'Cause I feel.
And that's why contemplative is the other half of my skill.
But sometimes I feel like I hate something and I think about how it sucks.
Sometimes I hate something, but it's not awful. That's when I hate it even more.
I think my least favorite is uninspiring fiction. Not like gutter trash where it will like visually offend me, but just uninspiring where I really don't get anything out of it and I don't see any kind of profound emotional detail in it. So I'm literally just watching it. There's no...
I've seen some works that you can finish your last word.
There's no response.
There's no response. Okay. I was going to say, I've seen some works that I just feel like they don't do anything right. They don't try to do anything that would like make me care, make me interested, keep my attention. And when they do try something, it's like just cheap or cliche or insincere. Like, you can tell that they're like really trying to get you to have a certain response, but not like doing the legwork.
Yeah. And that's what happens when you go for the payoff without kind of building
the setup.
Yeah, without building on a really great idea like you were talking about before. It can feel really inauthentic, and that often has to do with the tone, I think, with more grounded stories, because if you don't feel like the world that the characters inhabit is an authentic and kind of reasonable setting, you probably won't connect to them if their issues are supposed to be kind of trivial or day-to-day misunderstandings or something. That's where we kind of enter the realm of, oh, this was contrived, oh, this doesn't make any sense. And then you totally lose the emotional response.
Yeah, and like this,
writing conflict for the sake of conflict is always a little
I was gonna say, this idea of setup and payoff, like, it really relates to everything. Like, in a mystery, there's a setup and a payoff. In comedy, there is a setup and a punchline. In a romance, you need to set up the relationship before paying it off. It's because like each time you open a new book or play a new first episode of a show or play a new movie, then you're like entering a whole new space that has different rules and different parameters and different elements, So they need to set those up in order to get you to care. and that applies not just to get you to like understand what's happening, but for you to understand and resonate with the intention of whatever it's trying to accomplish.
I think you can run into a lot of issues with seasonal anime where it feels kind of like they don't have anywhere to go. Either they're adapting only part of a story, so they have to cut off really suddenly, and it's hard to make it kind of an organic ending point. I think I took that from Bloom Into You, where I was really into the world and the characters, and I thought the presentation was kind of interesting. But since the story only adapted part of the manga, it just cut off midway through the story, and then there was no real resolution. And so my emotional response went from, oh wow, I'm really invested in their relationship, in these characters and whether they'll be able to figure things out in their life, to, I guess it's over now.
Yeah, and then you touch on like an interesting thing there too, which is, endings, resolutions, kind of the counterpart to the hook.
Before you start talking about Berserk, I just want to mention, I recently thought about that too, and I think only 20% of the story anime I watched are probably actually completed works.
Yeah, it's a real problem because it's just so frequent.
It doesn't happen often.
Yeah, like from last season, like Furukechi was like a book. I think that was complete. Decadence was an anime original. Everything else was an adaptation of shit that's going on forever.
Yeah, and it's really hard because if you're not really into it, your emotions can kind of fade, especially if you're waiting 2 or 3 years for another season.
The amount of times I finished an anime and added the manga to my plan to read and still haven't read it. 700 times, yeah. At least.
I was going to say, the hook and the resolution is, another shape that the setup and payoff takes,
Yeah.
So it all kind of comes back to that.
And I think it's really impressive when a story or when an anime can do in one cour what other stories might take, 24 episodes or multiple seasons to do. Like single cour anime that really provoke a lot of emotion and build a lot of intrigue have always been kind of uniquely interesting to me. Something like SSSS Gridman really sticks out to me because it got me very, very invested within probably 5 or 6 episodes and still gave me that big emotional payoff that I wanted by the end without falling off.
Yeah, definitely. And like we've seen what happens when an ending is bad, Game of Thrones being the categorical example.
Yep.
Though, like, the saving grace of Game of Thrones Season 8 being as bad as it was is that it's not real. Just like books aren't real, Game of Thrones Season 8 isn't real. Because it wasn't written by the original author.
Exactly.
So, call that canon, if you will, but it's more like, you choose yourself what is the real work that you're invested in. And, like, the real work we were all invested in is the story written by George R.R. Martin, not the show produced by David and Dan.
That applies pretty much directly to Psychopaths as well, because Urobuchi Gen, his writing on season 1 could be said to be what is a big part of the show's appeal for tons of people. And then he left the project and everyone says don't watch season 2. I haven't watched season 2. I love season 1, but the pure consensus cut me away.
If anything changes about a work, especially if the author changes, then, it's entirely up to you whether you want to accept it. Like what I do is, if I like something, I'm like, okay, I'll integrate this into my mental picture of what this work represents in the physical world. Versus if I don't like it, I'll just be like, well, that isn't valid for this and that reason. But, if it is the original author that then failed with their ending, then it's like, oh, there's no escape. There's no way I can ignore this.
There are some ways you can kind of work around it. I think with Steins Gate, because the adaptation of Steins Gate 0 was so messy, I kind of just...
we still haven't seen that.
I kind of just sorted it into the back of my mind, and I still associate Steins Gate with my kind of, oh, it's peak fiction, I'm super interested the whole time kind of response.
Yeah.
Because you can, if a story resolves itself completely in the end, and then years later they build on
A
it,
sequel comes
then
out.
I can kind of forgive it. I can kind of just ignore it exactly for existing.
Like, I mean, this is also by different creators, but the Disney Star Wars trilogy, we're like, oh, it ruined the characters that I love, and it's like, well, for one, it wasn't made by the same people, and also it's not part of like the same lineage, or well, it is part of the same lineage, but like the same group of works that were made like around a close time, similar circumstances.
Yeah, it's an attempt at telling a continuation of a story from a different perspective. I mean, if you bring in a totally different author, of course their interpretation of the story will differ in some way, and that it's basically inevitable.
And then you get to works like Berserk. We finally got there. Or Hunter x Hunter, or Vagabond, or Nana, anything else that's likely not getting finished. Even A Song of Ice and Fire, the only book series in the world, might not get finished. And therein lies this issue, because resolutions are important. But as long as it doesn't betray you, you can like somewhat still hold on to those emotions for a long time. Like people who have read these works have held on to if Berserk is your favorite manga, which it is to me, I could keep it that way for years, even if it's on hiatus, or a chapter only comes out once every 4 months or so. Versus if it had ended, had not delivered on my expectations, then you lose the ability to hold on to that hope, or that static experience, like that frozen in time feeling.
Yeah, and your nostalgia about the series.
And like some people prefer it that way, with something like Vagabond, where it may never get finished, but they're still like, I still would prefer this than if he ended it in a rushed way, or some such thing. Versus me, when I like tweeted about Tokyo Ghoul and Ishida Sui, it was like Ishida Sui's health and emotional well-being was like really falling apart late into Tokyo Ghoul because of the physical strain of being a mangaka. And so he, kind of, wrapped it up maybe a little sooner than he otherwise would have, which makes it, not a perfect final arc.
Mm-hmm.
Still a very great one, in my opinion. And I'm just like deeply happy that he at least did finish it in the end. Because if, it's just left up in the air and, or completely abandoned, then it's like you lose that payoff. Even if the payoff isn't the 10 out of 10 it could be, still better than nothing.
Yeah, and
as long as it's in the positives.
There are ways of kind of finding a resolution at a midpoint in a story that will satisfy most fans of the work. Like Sangatsu no Lion or the Hunter x Hunter 2011 adaptation.
Anime.
Yeah. They end without telling the full story, but they end at a point in the story where there's a clear resolution to an arc, or a clear temporary resolution to the feelings of the cast that really satisfies the viewer or the reader for the most part.
Yeah, same with like my favorite TV show Mindhunter, which currently has 2 seasons out. Each season starts, a new narrative arc that is resolved by the end of the season. And like there is more planned, and there's a lot more that could happen. It's not like you're like, oh, the story is over now, but it is over. Like in the sense that there is nothing left waiting to be resolved. There is just things waiting to be started, if that makes sense. And A Silent Voice also, the movie, finished, somewhere in the middle of the manga, right?
Yeah, it does have a different conclusion, and it definitely cuts out a lot of kind of the day-to-day of the characters. There's a different ending, but
the ending to the movie is like original.
Yeah.
And it cuts out like basically all the side characters I don't know if I'll call them arcs, but like introspective. It's very it's very
Deeper characterization.
yeah. It's like an Ishida movie. It's about him, you know.
Yeah, it's about the main characters.
It's about the main character and Shoko, and the manga is more about everyone.
Yeah, and there are ways of telling a story with a different focus and still telling it very well. I think A Silent Voice is an excellent example of that because
I agree.
the manga spends a lot more time, like you said, with the supporting characters and the entire cast, but the very singular focus of the film adaptation really kind of builds that emotional connection. You're kind of seeing the world through Ishida's eyes, and because of that, you get really, really invested, and that anime original ending is a big payoff because it's a payoff for Ishida. It's a payoff for the focus of the film. So even though it takes it in a different direction than the manga, it really builds a story that a lot of people can love and a lot of people can get something out of.
And it's also, about buying your time, essentially. Because, like, I mean, I haven't read A Silent Voice, so you can, like, maybe confirm this or deny it. But, like, in my opinion, the movie adaptation is, like, so densely packed and filled with content for its, movie length runtime. I don't remember if it was, like,
yeah, it's about 2 hours.
It's about 2
hours.
It's a very long movie, yeah.
Maybe 2 hours and 6 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've watched it 7 times, so
2:15.
yeah, it all blends
While
together.
the manga is like 60 or 80 chapters, less than 100, but still a sizable amount. And even if there is technically more content, more depth to the characters, that is stretched over like a much longer period of time. So it's just like how a manga like Hunter x Hunter might have one arc that's like an 8 out of 10 and then one arc that's like 10 out of 10. Like the A Silent Voice movie just condenses all the 10 out of 10 into this movie, and like therefore it doesn't need to have the extra
Exactly.
that the manga
Exactly. Some people call it like cutting out the fat of the story, just like the parts of the story that aren't essential
as necessary.
in communicating, it seems. And like you said, it's 64 chapters, the manga, whereas the film's only 2 hours. And so Yamada, storyboarding it and directing it, had to figure out a way to kind of express the ideas and the emotions of the story in a much more obviously audiovisual, so you get more avenues to express those ideas, but in a much more compact form. And so making a film that has substance is very, very difficult. You just have so much less time to communicate your ideas that unless you've got some kind of visual intrigue or subtextual meaning implied, you can't really tell a full story. And I think that's what makes films like A Silent Voice so special, because they manage to do basically everything that I would personally want in a story within such a condensed time format.
Yeah, I really like when things are very packed and really like give you a lot of meat for your money. A lot of
Oh damn.
a lot of depth for its time, or for your time watching it.
How's it coming? Fish.
Just go. I was going to bring something else up.
Okay, before you do that then, coming back to what Ben said before about how many anime there are with like one core that really accomplish things. I think density in a short time frame is definitely really appreciated, and it really shows that how good a writer can be, I think.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, of course, some stories have to be longer, but if you can say a lot in as little time you can without wasting time or resources, it's really impressive.
Yeah, and as a Shinkai fan, both of my favorite Shinkai films are the shorter ones, Garden of Words and 5 centimeters per second.
Us too.
And a lot of what I get out of that is that kind of very dense but thematically rich expression of a realistic setting in so little time relative to many films is what really appeals to me about Shinkai's work. I think his longer films kind of get a bit muddy or kind of lost sometimes in terms of what they're trying to say. And you can really tell that he's a skilled writer when you watch something like The Garden of Words, because you can see just how much he can pack into a story.
Yeah, and it's also you can see the writing through the visuals and the presentation. Like you can picture the way something is shot or acted as written in the script. Like, and then this character does this and that, and like in the movie, that's all visual, but it is still written in the script or written in the mind of the performer or the director.
Yeah, and when
so then we get to that aesthetic is narrative, or visual storytelling as a whole, or any other storytelling that's not narration or dialogue, traditionally spoken or written. Like, you could picture a novel might be good because the prose is very beautiful and descriptive and like gives you these metaphors and this imagery that really sells a feeling or an idea. And then you have like a manga like Innocent, where a lot of the metaphors and the symbolism is visual, and like you could just like look at a page of Innocent and imagine that page or that image being described in a book, and you'd be like, this is an amazingly written book.
Yeah,
but it's just a picture.
Someone showed me like one page of A Song of Ice and Fire, like randomly, and I read it, and the prose was like so interesting to read. Just that one page, I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna read this now.
Yeah,
like his writing is really impressive.
George R.R. Martin's writing is like very, like it can be flowery or it can be very blunt at the same time.
Yeah, doing a mic drop in text is really interesting.
Yeah, like timing and rhythm and pacing, like dynamics.
I've read now 2 Sarikoto books, and I've seen pages of Monogatari around, and so many pages have like just the mic drop or the what is it called, a banger, just a banger line at the end of the chapter, where you just read them and be like, damn, that emotional payoff kind of when you're reading it.
Nisuisin is especially great at like really leading you to these points of climax in the dialogue, like just the characters talking, and then it leads to a revelation or a punchline or an emotional climax.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have someone like William Shakespeare, especially in some of his earlier works like Macbeth. There was a style of writing at that time period, I don't remember the name of it, but it's essentially writing that's based on sounding beautiful when spoken rather than making sense or being understandable.
Yeah.
And so, like, a lot of people find that writing, mind-blowingly beautiful, like very wonderful to listen to when acted or even read. It's just like, wow, this is so flowery and beautifully written.
Yeah.
While like someone like me can be like, huh? What did you say?
I think...
Or me.
I think iambic pentameter is cool. Like the rhythmic pattern of a lot of Shakespeare's writing.
Of poetry.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think I appreciate it a lot more when I see an author or a writer who can combine really descriptive imagery with those great one-liners and bangers, like F said, because it shows like versatility, and that's what you want in a story. If it's really, really single focused, it has to be very, very good at delivering on that single focus. Whereas if it spreads out a little more with its kind of thematic interpretations, and it does so well, you can kind of get a much higher reaching narrative overall.
And there's also like what I was saying before about expressions of emotion. If you look at like William Shakespeare's writing in the context of that idea, then like, the flowery, very descriptive words, fit into the box of being, an exaggeration of emotion, which would, make it more powerful to the reader. While like at the same time, there's several lines in Macbeth that I thought just were clearly stretched out or worded in like a very nonsensical way. Not just like a complicated way, but like a inconsistent way, like a contradictory or a meaningless way, and that reaches the point of like an awkward or inorganic expression of emotion. So like it has exaggeration to the emotion and also like emotion that I can't identify with.
Yeah.
At the same time, and as I said, like when something feels awkward or inorganic, then like immediately it takes you out of it.
And that's the problem when you
that's a good example.
run into something that's written in a very, very specific way. Like if they don't allow themselves the freedom to mix up the structure a bit and to use, both flowery language and blunt language, use very kind of nuanced moments and very direct moments, you end up with a story that's essentially limited in how far it can go and how much the audience can kind of take out of it.
Yeah, and one thing I've wanted to bring up for almost the entire duration of this podcast, it was when F said ambiguity.
Oops.
And I was thinking of using that to lead into this idea of subtlety.
Yes.
You can have double meanings or underlying meanings or details, things that aren't easily noticeable, so that you get something out of both a clearly communicated and digestible story, as well as something more that you can dig into if you have the capacity or interest for it. And like Mindhunter, my favorite TV show, is also a great example of this, especially in the interview scenes that take place between the main characters and the serial killers that they speak to, where a lot of it is based in the editing. Like, what does the camera show? Like, does it show our main character's reaction in response to a line spoken by the subject, Or does it show the subject's reaction to something said, asked as a question? How is the camera positioned? Like, how fast do the cuts happen? And, like the rhythm, how is the rhythm paced out? And like, you understand a ton, and this is true for a lot of David Fincher's films as well. Like, you understand a lot about how the characters feel, what they're thinking, and like what's happening beneath what they're saying, just by how it's cut and edited and shot.
Yeah, and the reason why Naoko Yamada is my favorite filmmaker and A Silent Voice is my favorite film in general is that she can fit so much expression and nuance into her storyboards and into the facial expressions or mannerisms of her characters that the whole time you're watching, there's something else to take out of it aside from dialogue or feeling. There's a much deeper expression of all of the feelings of the characters and the atmosphere of the world when you can kind of build a slightly more nuanced portrayal of a typical setting. And I mean, Yamada's work is often or entirely based on high school settings, but she kind of works around the setting and builds it into something more and more atmospheric through her storyboarding and shot composition and how much expression she puts into the little mannerisms of her characters.
Well, I think this is a strength of a lot of KyoAni works, especially within anime, like the anime as a medium.
Mm-hmm.
KyoAni works have a special tendency to have very nuanced and intricate expressions, in terms of body language, especially.
Yeah.
I think it's like Violet Evergarden. Violet Evergarden is the most emotionally charged KyoAni work. Like, it has the most dramatic elements and the heaviest emotions, you could say, which is a great reason why it's one of my favorites. You gotta aim high to get high.
And Violet definitely aims very high in its presentation.
Right. In the case of Yamada specifically, I think a lot of the time she gets too caught up or hung up in showing the different ways emotion can be expressed rather than the depth of the expression. So it's more about the breadth of it than the depth. Like, oh, look, you can, see something expressed through the characters by how they walk or how they move their hands, or how the ponytail wags when she walks, or her backpack wags when she walks. And I'm like, yes, I see that there is something expressed here, but there are more important things that could be expressed.
That's probably why you don't like Liz and the Bluebird as much as I do.
It is. That's what I was just
You're
trying
describing
to explain.
the opening scene perfectly.
Yeah, because I said
yeah.
that when he watched it.
and I think a silent voice is a great example of like how to do it perfectly, because a large part of the themes that a silent voice is about is, communication, specifically non-verbal communication, because Shoko is depth. Depth is deaf.
Yeah.
So much
she's
depth.
also she's also super depth.
Yes.
And they use sign language, therefore showing hands. The expressiveness of hands is very important.
Yeah, and the breadth of expression is a key part of the storytelling.
Yeah, it's very important. I don't think it is as important in Liz and the Bluebird, and I think the original TV show of Euphonium does a better job at like showing emotion in a more traditional way. In the key factors. Faces, voice, and overall, crying, stuff like that. Are more powerful expressions of emotion than your backpack wagging when you walk.
But continuing on this, a lot of people appreciate these visual cues in the shows to what's the word? I don't know, it adds to the theming, but for me, oftentimes it just seems a little overt and on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really add to the substance.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, this is a very interesting thing. Like in something like Violet Evergarden, perhaps, like a character might be experiencing like an intense anger, and the camera only shows them, clenching their fist. That's a good example of subtlety, where like if you show intense bursts of emotion like very in your face all the time, then that can get like a bit much. So sometimes if an emotion is stronger, it might be good to show it subtly, like, don't show their face when they're really pissed off, just show their hand, While something like Liz and the Bluebird does the opposite with it and makes it unsubtle. Like it shows the subtleties in order to like really put it in your face.
Also, like
instead of to hide.
In general, anime direction too. Hyoka comes to mind. When a character feels a certain way, where they, how do you call it? They cut off the lower half of the face, so you only see the eyes, and they like divert their eye direction to a different place to show they are uncomfortable or something.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's performance.
I think it's worth defending Liz and the Bluebird a bit. Because it's one of my favorites.
I was waiting for it. Yeah, do it.
But I think the way that it kind of wears its emotions very openly is something that really adds to the story for me, because the narrative itself is about two girls, obviously, but it's about kind of the problems in their relationship that are so plain to see, but that they don't address. And the reason why the narrative comes to such a kind of dramatic conclusion where they confront each other and begin to understand each other more is because they spent so much time being friends with each other and, expressing emotions to each other without really telling each other how they feel and what's important to them and where they want to go with their lives. And so the way Yamada shows each character really just wearing their emotions and not hiding them so much as the characters don't notice each other's feelings. But for the viewer, you can see it. It's in plain sight. It's right there because Yamada shows it in every frame. And that's why the opening scene is so fascinating to me, because it spends the entire time focusing on the way Mizore feels emotions, the way she kind of shifts nervously while she's waiting, the way she glances around, the way she looks up and pauses and gets kind of caught in a trance. And then the way Nozomi acts, where she's very, very vibrant. She twirls while she's walking into the school and going up the stairs, whereas Mizore is very kind of shy and quiet. And you can see the way that those emotions are so openly and consistently expressed builds to the viewer the idea that there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface that both characters are kind of oblivious to, but is very, very evident.
And at the same time, what's beneath the surface is being brought to the surface.
Yeah, exactly.
And like the entire time you were talking there, I was just like pontificating to myself. I was just like, he's so right.
Well, thank you.
Because how do I phrase this? The entire movie, they are expressing themselves. They are communicating to each other, but because they aren't doing it verbally, neither of them see it. Like, we see it, but they don't.
Yeah, and you can see that.
And in some way that's, frustrating, because you're like, how do they not notice these obvious things? But it's because it's being made obvious to us.
Yeah.
To a degree. I mean, I don't think everything is some things definitely should be noticed by the characters as well. And that's part of the whole making the emotion feel natural and real element,
Yeah, and I think just and Yamada's done this at least twice, but those panels where they've got text on them and then the text gets scribbled out? The one for Liz and the Bluebird is disjoint and then scratches out the dis and it's joint, and it's the entire point of the story.
That was the best.
That was
the best
thing.
I like them.
I love
their kind of perception of reality is disjoint, and their relationship as a result is disjoint. Everything about the way they communicate with each other is disjoint. And so Yamada chooses to openly express this to emphasize just how kind of disjoint they are, just how connected they are without really reaching each other. And this ties in perfectly to basically all of my favorite stories, and something that I've wanted to write about, or at least talk about, for a long time, which is the idea of kind of breaking the barriers between our hearts. I think Eva is probably my favorite example of this, where they literally depict
a physical example of them breaking the barriers between people.
And I think a lot of the emotional potency of fiction for me is about those human connections and how you can never really know another person, but you can still, reach out to them. You can still build a bridge despite, how fortified those barriers are and how difficult it can be to reach someone. And so when you have a character that doesn't really let people in, a lot of my favorite characters like Mizore and Nozomi don't let people in, and then you can put them in a situation where they're eventually forced to break that barrier and kind of connect on a real level, on a real human level. The emotional payoff, at least for me, is massive.
And I think that's why the theme of human connection is so popular as well as poignant.
Been there and done that.
Especially because if you are someone who is passionate about fiction, who consumes a lot of fiction, you are most likely doing it because you want to connect with the characters.
Yeah.
Which is wanting to connect with people in a way. And so, that being reflected in the story itself is, an emotion that you're always in tune with because you're trying to engage with the work, and that, inherently puts you in a state of mind that has you understanding the themes intuitively.
That reminds me, someone on Twitter asked...
Also reason why Ava is
the top one.
Someone on Twitter asked, why do you consume fiction? And most replies were, to understand myself better, etc. And I was the only one who actually said, to understand other people better.
Yeah. To understand the human condition. To understand the way people...
This is my human condition.
I think that's a great point, because a lot of people... say, this anime changed my life because the way the story was told made me realize that I should go out more or something. But for me, when I get a really, really, really powerful story, it's telling me more about how I can connect with people more and how I can understand the world with more nuance. And seeing really, really talented writers and directors express their ideas so openly and so honestly in some of their best works is kind of a gateway to building that understanding of the world and other people and what brings us together and what keeps us apart.
Yeah, and piece of fiction or a piece of work is partly an expression of the creator's both experience and worldview. So in regards to what I said about fiction and media being like a proxy way to experience things you otherwise wouldn't, it also like inherently lets you understand people because you're seeing into the experience and worldview of the creator, and therefore understanding the creator by watching it.
Yeah, and I think something that really helped me kind of understand what Yamada was going for in Listen to Bluebird is watching A Silent Voice so many times. Like, I've watched it 7 times, and so...
Congrats. I watched it like
Thanks.
3 times.
But because of that, I'm so familiar with her, like her idiosyncrasies, I guess, the way she expresses herself visually, that when I got to Listen to Bluebird, I kind of connected with it. I kind of connected with exactly what she was trying to do, and I got a little more out of it than some of my friends even who might have watched it and thought it was a bit boring or dull, because sure, there's expression there, but I'm not really getting much out of it. It's kind of dull to me. Whereas for me, I'm like, this is so Yamada. This is exactly what I want out of a Yamada work.
Yeah, it's interesting when you like have a somewhat connection to the creator.
Yeah, you can kind of, once you familiarize yourself with someone creating work of fiction, your interpretation of it can kind of build into something much more personal than you might get by just watching a random film that someone recommended to you.
Like unlike Crit, I actually read The Climber by Sakamoto before. So I understand his kind of storytelling, and it like really connects with me personally a lot. Especially The Climber has like a character seek to be alone, which is an interesting theme for a character. So that's something that connects to me personally. And Sakamoto's way of exploring things is very visual.
Very visual.
So I read Climber and Innocent, and he continues to do these things, and so I can really connect to him as a creator, because I'm like, this is how I want my manga to be like, not just because his artwork is incredible, but just his visual storytelling is next level.
Sakamoto's storytelling is so visual that sound effects don't even exist in his manga.
Really?
Yeah. He doesn't use them.
Homonopipia. I cannot pronounce it the same.
He said in the Toko Toko like documentary video that was made about him, he said that he used this example from The Climber where an iceberg or a glacier like shatters, and he's like, how does he express the sound of that? And he's like, well, people don't usually know what that sounds like, but they might know what a building collapse sounds like because, movies, for example. And therefore, like, to express the sound, he drew a whole spread of a building shattering between the iceberg shattering.
Wow.
So, like you see the iceberg shattering, and then you hear the building shattering because it's placed in between.
Also, one thing I really liked, too, in The Climber was there was like a sunrise on the mountains, and he illustrated the feeling of seeing a sunrise by having pages before where an orchestra is playing as a build-up, and I really felt that personally, because for one, I really like mountains and sunrise and the orchestra. So
he does stuff like that, like in Innocent, when a man's limbs are being torn off during an execution, and the main character is the executioner. It has the main character playing a violin, and then one by one, each of the 4 strings representing the 4 limbs snap off.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, I did that.
I've got to read Innocent.
Yes, sir. Yeah. There are like many moments where it's kind of like direction, too, but like in manga, where like in direction, the composition in general, where you like, I don't know, use objects to symbolize something or frame a certain way by having objects interact with it. It's kind of similar.
Yeah,
like that.
And the paneling and how much focus the artist gives to each part of a scene can really bring out some elements. A lot of panels in Monster have a really specific focus on items like in the background or something, and I find that really, really interesting to me, just because it's just a normal room, but the way that it's been framed makes me focus so heavily on one spot, that I'm like, wow.
That's like someone's room decor is also like the way they walk, an expression of their character.
Yeah, exactly. They do that in Gridman as well, where you see Akane. Yeah, her room is just
full of
a
trash.
mess. It's full of trash, and it.
Or Misato's apartment.
Yeah, it represents their mental kind of instability and the messiness of their lives.
Or the Tatami Galaxy is like all about this.
Yeah.
This is why background art is important.
Just like it's important to convey setting as well. And setting is also important to convey character, or to inform character.
I've read certain manga lately where the lack of backgrounds has actually
hurt you,
like hurt my experience, because I wasn't sure how to read the room. Like, how is the space? How is it paced? And one certain,
how does it feel?
How does it? Yeah, like I wasn't sure what place I am placed, and then I went and read Beasters, which actually has backgrounds, and I was like, oh, this is completely different.
Yeah, the use of space.
And like going back to Sakamoto, a lot of Sakamoto's, or a lot of them, all of Sakamoto's manga have like a very strong use of, like, when you're in the Sanson family dinner room, there's like this oppressive darkness and shadows that like drowns out the characters, or like that can communicate like a claustrophobia or a loneliness or a sense of dread, versus bright beaming sunlight could express a feeling of joy and beauty.
Yeah, and I know you guys just talked about manga art, but being able to draw very detailed and expressive backgrounds, and then also kind of juxtapose those with simpler paneling or simpler portrayals of ideas visually, you can get a very nice, like very straightforward effect, kind of like in a Yamada film or something, where she has such specific shot composition, but she might in a climax just build to a very, very straightforward centered shot. And it's kind of like the juxtaposition of knowing how much they're capable of when they're trying to just tell a regular story versus when they're trying to really, really be direct with their presentation, kind of gives a certain value to it that I can really appreciate. And that basically just speaks to versatility, which we already talked about.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about directing and, artwork, visual storytelling, when this is supposed to be about writing.
Yeah, I was about to say.
It's because all of those things like are part of the writing. It's like it's expressions, it's information. Like all of it is placed there in order to. It's text. Like you're taught in school. Everything is text.
Also because
pictures, text.
We are not that read, as you only know one book.
We're not that well read.
We're not that well read, so I can't really talk literally about writing, but I think visuals enhance the experience / the writing.
As someone who's
read
talked
about them.
some books.
Oh my god, he
some
did.
books, yeah, wow. I can definitely attest to the idea that being able to express that flowery descriptive writing visually is a real skill, and a really important skill in adapting a written work, because if you can build a setting, if you can build a room visually in a way that matches the detail and the attention to detail of a written work, you can create a very, very atmospheric and very immersive setting. Like, obviously, you can just have a normal room, but if you match the shadows described by the author, or you match the framing of the room, you can really...
Then it's equally as much writing, or it is also writing.
Yeah, the audiovisual component is a part of it. It's inseparable from the narrative itself, yeah.
And it's also more time efficient, as we said. It allows you to put more information, more depth into a smaller time without losing part of it.
Yeah, like Night is Short, Walk On Girl has so much going on, and so much going on visually as well, that when I first watched it, I was basically just floored. I was amazed because I was like, wow, how did they fit so much stuff into an hour and a half of runtime without telling a completely nonsensical story? Like, there was still an emotional through line, there was still substance, and there was a lot of artistic flair, but it was so condensed that I was amazed, you know?
I feel like I've said all that I need to say.
Yeah,
At least for the time
Likewise.
me too. So let's make a conclusion. What is needed for good writing? In short,
I would say
no, you've
versatility.
got everything.
I would say versatility, like the ability of a creator to express themselves in different ways and in unique ways to kind of draw in the audience.
Versatility and authenticity.
Yes,
I would also
exactly.
I would also say ambitiousness and expression
Yes.
and consistency.
Yeah, and you really need to be able to bring all of those things together to tell a really great, a really balanced
Balance.
story.
And density. While being well paced.
Yes. I think that's it.
That's it. That's the idea.
That is good writing.
You gotta have at least some of those things, preferably all of them, in order to be one of the best.
Exactly. I think we're done.
Yeah.
Will you do the end?
I don't know what to say. You do it.
That was the end of this podcast, episode 3, Podcasting is War with Critical F and bentosekai.
Follow us all on Twitter.
Let him return once more.
Yes.
And
Thank you
goodbye.
for having me.
You're welcome.